David, it's my pleasure to welcome you, and you can talk to your title's too long for me to read it.
Good to see you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for coming out at 7 p.m. I guarantee you'll be asleep by 8. Not sooner. Oh, my friend. So, to me, there are lots of issues about the future of humanity which really come down to individual choices that will end up being made by 9 billion people. And as such, it's a sort of a scary time for humanity. I became interested in agriculture, not because my training is in it, but because first, agriculture as well as burning of fossil fuels. Those are the two biggest things humans do to support our lifestyles. And they have huge impacts on the world and its future sustainability. And I also am interested in agriculture because I'm a humanist, and I really want all the people of the world to have an equitable, healthy, sustainable supply of food. And I would love the world to have people living lives at least as good as we are, not just now, but 100 or 1,000 and 10,000 years into the future. So I think looking ahead at how we can support a large number of people living healthy lives all around the world, to me, is one of the really big questions that we face. I'd love to share with you the results of some of my analyses. So, there we go. So, clearly, food is essential. We have food systems now that provide food for 7.5 billion people. 0.8 billion, 800 million, are malnourished. 2.1 billion are overnourished. Right? But clearly these food systems are essential for us. They're the basis of our societies. They allow us to dedicate our time to things other than feeding ourselves, so we can do the intellectual things, the jobs, the various things that we do with our lives other than grow food. But they're also, there's a big downside. They are a major cause of harm to the environment. About a third of all greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. They are the major source of pollution, groundwaters, lakes, rivers, streams, and so on. The nitrogen also that is put on that becomes ammonia, some of it evaporates into the air, and it's the nucleation site that forms very fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, which when breathed in is a major risk to human health. And agriculture is also the single greatest factor threatening species with extinction. So I'm going to talk about these things and talk about what are really a whole series of linked problems and opportunities that we have. Basically, now that there are 7.5 billion humans heading toward a population that will level off at maybe 9.5 or 10 billion, I might hope, but we'll see. Maybe I won't see, but someone will see, I hope. What we do in any one thing that we need really impacts many, many other aspects of the world and our lives. So the diets, as I'll show you today, that we eat have a huge impact on our health, on our medical costs. They impact food demand, which affects what crops are grown, how much land has to be cleared, the extinctions that occur, greenhouse gas emissions, fertilizers, water pollution. All these things are linked. And any change to one of these has implications for the others. And some of those are negative and some are very positive implications. So here is where we stand right now. We're undergoing what nutritionists call the great global nutrition transition. Our diets are changing. As incomes increase and as more people live in cities, diets change in ways. I love data, so I hope you don't mind some data. I think this is the right button for there. Good. So here is meat consumption per person, grams of meat protein per day, and this is income. And these are data for the 100 biggest nations of the world from 1961 until now. I divided these nations into a group based upon their incomes from the richest A to the poorest F, plus treated India and China separately. And what you can see is a pretty consistent pattern. If you will, the economists would say people are revealing their preferences. As people have more income, they eat more meat. As they have income, they eat more refined fats, sugars, alcohol, and so on, and oils. These sort of empty calories also go up very greatly, from very few to 1,400 calories, 1,300 calories a day for the typical person in Western countries. And total kilocalories that we eat, we call them calories colloquially, we should have around 2,500. We're eating in the richest countries over 3,000 calories per day, per person. So that's maybe not a surprise as to why we have some problems. And the result of this global transition in the kinds of foods we eat as we become richer and are more urbanized is greatly increased incidence of diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. In fact, the World Health Organization says that these non-communicable diseases, diet-dependent diseases, are now the greatest global burden of disease. If you will, they're the greatest thing that are harming the quality of life on average around the world. So, because our diets shift toward more meat, because it takes a lot of land, a lot of grain to produce that meat, and because we are eating more calories, even though the population of the world is only going to increase, and I shouldn't say only, 2 billion or so people, 30% in the next 50 or so years, we estimate we're going to have to grow between 100 and 110% more crops. We're going to have to double crop production to feed 30% more people because they will be richer, demanding more meat, calories, and so on. And so what are the implications of growing that extra food, of doubling global food production on Earth? Well, I'll show you some of our forecasts for this. First, I mentioned right now 30% of all the greenhouse gases are emitted by agriculture. They're emitted from nitrogen fertilizer, which when soil microbes convert it into nitrous oxide, laughing gas, which is nothing to laugh about, is 300 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. That's about a third, it's about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from that. 10% come from carbon dioxide that is emitted when we clear land and when the vegetation that was living on that land, the trees and so on, are either burned or decomposed. And the rest comes from energy use and so on in agriculture. That's what we're doing now. Our projections are that by the year 2060, and I would say these are optimistic projections that assume our technology can keep advancing into the future as it has been in the past, we're going to increase greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. Right now, we release twice as much greenhouse gas from producing our food as we do from all the vehicles that we drive, fly, etc. Ships, cars, airplanes. Twice as much right now comes out from our food, and we're going to, while we're trying to cut down on those emissions, we're going to increase by 80% the greenhouse gas emissions that come from food. It's a really huge effect of where we're heading with our diets changing as they are changing. We're going to have to increase, to produce that much more food, we're going to increase fertilizer inputs by about 150%, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on. And that will increase the rate at which waters around the world are being polluted, groundwaters, lakes, rivers, streams, and nearshore ocean with the nutrients coming into them. So that's another very serious effect. And you might know in many developing countries around the world, China is one that has very heavy fertilization, have very low water quality such that major sources of water for cities of 10 and 20 million people by the middle of many summers cannot be used because they are so polluted with algae and the toxins that the blue-green algae release. Here's another thing I just want to show. This is some work that's not yet out, but a colleague of ours, Andrew Goodkind, I'm one of the et als down there. This is from growing corn, one crop in the United States. Corn requires lots of fertilization. And you can look at two impacts of corn. One is the profit a farmer makes by growing it. And the other is the health impact using the EPA's model of the value of human life, of years of life lost, and the health impact of breathing in this fine particulate matter, PM 2.5. It just means particulate matter with a size of 2.5 microns that is formed by some of the nitrogen fertilizer that evaporates into the air and blows downwind. And the net benefit to society is negative $500 for every hectare of land, that's 2.5 acres of land, that is farmed to corn any place that looks red here. Because although there's profit from growing the corn, the health impact on humans is so much greater than the profit from the corn that is negative $500 per hectare going up in some areas to plus $500 of profit when there aren't many people living near where that corn is grown. Now, you can get rid of a lot of that problem by applying the right kind of nitrogen in the right way. That's this graph here. You still have some big problems. And if you apply not just the right amount of nitrogen, the best form of nitrogen in the right way, but you actually apply the right amount to give the maximum benefit to society, but not to farmers. So here's a conflict, society versus farmer. If you do that, then you can have the outcome here where most of these places are profitable places to grow, societally profitable places to grow corn, but not necessarily that profitable for the farmer. So again, we have to ask what we value, and I'm not going to give an answer, but that's just indication of one of the things that's happening right now in agriculture. Well, the UN projects more people around the world, and a lot of that population growth is projected to happen in sub-Saharan African countries. There also are projections of what will happen to income. And because we know how diets depend on income, we can ask, what will the average diet be in each of these countries with the income that they're supposed to have in the future? And with how many people they have, what's going to happen to their demand for food here in the year 2060 compared to what it was in the year 2010. And what you can see here is that there are a series of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have ratios of 5, some of them even 6 and 7, needing 5 or 6 or 7 times more food produced in that nation in the year 2060 than they needed in the year 2010. A huge increase in demand. And that increase in demand is going to lead to a lot of land being cleared to grow this extra food, 700 million hectares. That's about 80% of the size of the United States. So it's about that amount of land being cleared over here. And when that land is cleared, the animals that used to live on it and the plants that used to live on it can't live on it. So we did some modeling of the effects of agriculture on the risks of extinction in various countries around the world and published this in Nature last year. And what this shows the extinction risk for large animals. A large animal here we define as something bigger than about 20 pounds, 10 kilograms, 22 pounds. So those are the large mammals and what their extinction risk is. And right now, the highest extinction risk for large animals in the world is in Asia. That's the 2010 number. African risks are much lower than that. And South American risks are about like they are in Asia, not quite as high. And here's the risk we project for 2060. The Asian animals, if we keep doing the things we're doing, are going to, I don't know, I could say they'd be toast. They won't even be there to be anything organic. African animals will be more threatened than the Asian are now, and the South American animals will also be very threatened. Basically, this is the brink of another wave of extinction, getting rid of the vast majority of the remaining large animals of the world. We lost a lot of them in the Pleistocene extinction 10,000 years ago when Native Americans came here. It had the Clovis point that could penetrate tough hides and dined well by the La Brea tar pits and all over the continent. And we had massive extinction then. And this is the biggest component of a future extinction, I think, extinction that is likely to happen if we keep doing what we're doing. So what I really do for a living is study. I do lots of experiments in ecosystems. And I'm talking about not my real work, except right now I couldn't help show you a few things. This is one of our experiments, a diversity experiment in which we set up hundreds of plots and had either one plant species or 2 or 4 or 8 or 16. Planted in 1994. We've maintained it ever since then. And we know what's happening in each of these plots. We've been measuring them year by year. I can't show you much data. I would love to talk more quickly, but I really can't. That was supposed to be a joke, but I guess okay. You were supposed to be glad I couldn't. Here's just one thing. Each data point is a data from a plot. And so there's variation. Plots differ. But here are plots planted with 1 species, or 2, or 4, or 8, or 16. And look at this. If you look at these 1 species plots, this is each of the species that are living over here, but they're planted out by themselves. Here they're randomly chosen, planted out 2 at a time, or 4 at a time, or 8 at a time. Here they are all 16. And look at this. We're going from 100 to 300 something. These plots are 200% more productive, high diversity, the same exact species, but when growing together, produce 200% more biomass that we can harvest there every year. And even the most productive monoculture is less productive than anything growing with all 16 species together. There's a huge benefit of biodiversity. Biodiversity, it turns out, is one of the biggest factors ever discovered that influences how ecosystems operate. More diverse systems are, I'm not going to show you all the data. You have to come for a whole other talk for that. But basically, more diverse systems are more stable. They don't vary as much in response to climate change year to year. There's a lot lower incidence of disease and more in plant diseases in plots that have more plant species in them. More diverse systems capture more CO2 from the air, and they put some of it into their roots, which then die and end up building up organic matter in the soil, such that they're storing up not quite a ton of organic matter as carbon in the soil year after year after year from when this experiment began until now. We've had about a ton per year stored, sequestering carbon, which is a pretty important service. Because they're so good at high diversity systems, they're so good at taking up nutrients from the soil, the water that comes through there has had almost all the nutrients removed. It's much purer, cleaner, higher quality water. And that's really the same thing, is that they're really good at completely using the limiting resources in that soil when they have high diversity. I'll tell you why very quickly. You have a question?
Yes. When you do the diversity, do you plant 1, plant 2, plant 3, plant 4, or is it quadrants?
The whole plots are 30 by 30 feet, and we just sprinkled all the seeds across them and let them do whatever they did after that. Yeah, sure. So the essence of why diversity matters so much is this. When species evolve, each species evolved to become specialized. It does something really well, but there's a cost to doing one thing well. They do other things not so well. There are trade-offs. So each species is sort of a specialist that has something. It's like a human profession. You're a really good surgeon, but you're probably not a good something else, right? We're all trained to do one thing well, and we don't do other things well. You wouldn't come to me if you wanted surgery, and so on. So plants are much the same way. Species are much the same way. They're specialized. They do certain things well and other things poorly. When they interact with each other, competition only allows them to do what they do well. What they do poorly is irrelevant. Something else is doing that well, and it can't outcompete them for those conditions. So as there are more species, this system is much more efficient. Each one is doing something it does really well. It allows them to coexist, and when they coexist, it makes the system more stable, more productive, and so on. And if you look across all the different things we've manipulated experimentally, we have plots, experimental plots we burn or don't burn, some that have herbivores or not, some that we add CO2 or not, some that we impose drought or we add water, or we give different amounts of nitrogen, a major living resource, or we change diversity from 1 to 16 species. The biggest things that have ever been manipulated across all of our experiments, and another analysis did this for other experiments all around the world, the biggest factor influencing how ecosystems operate is their diversity. And we are causing a loss of diversity around the world by simplifying habitats and by leading species toward extinction. There really is a big environmental cost for the pathway that we are on right now. So this is sort of a quick summary of what I've showed you for the downside of trying to feed 9 billion people. A big increase in greenhouse gas emissions, a big increase in nutrient pollution from agriculture, and lots of land being cleared and the resultant risks of extinction going up around the world. So I want to now talk with you about solutions. So a lot of this problem comes from what we eat, food. So we know we waste a lot of food. We waste about 30% of the food that is produced on Earth. Different countries waste in different ways, but it's been argued we might be able to cut this in half. So we might be able to reduce food waste to about half of what it is. And that will get rid of about 15% of everything I told you, because everything I told you was linked to how much food was being demanded. So it's sort of a 15% solution. The issue really is, though, the big problem, though, is this 9 billion person problem. How are we going to convince people to waste less food? What's it going to take to actually have that be implemented? How can we achieve that goal? I don't have an answer, but it's one of the issues that all the solutions I'm going to show you will have. These are all paper solutions. They don't mean anything until they get adopted. And the biggest challenge is how we change what humans are willing to do. So what else? What about healthier diets? Well, we've done a lot of review of the literature. We looked at these very large cohort studies looking at 100,000 nurses followed for 30 years and so on, and looked at the data from all these and put it together in a paper we had in Nature a couple years ago. Here's the reduction in risk of diseases, here diabetes, for people eating a Mediterranean diet, about a 15% lower incidence of diabetes compared to a typical diet. A vegetarian diet is, 40-some% lower diabetes. In between is a vegetarian diet plus you eat fish, a pescatarian diet. Pretty dramatic effects, 40% less diabetes. That is a huge benefit for people. In fact, the data in for vegan diets, which I don't show because I don't have as many data, I don't want to show them, but the number right now is around a 60% reduction in diabetes for people who eat a vegan diet. And look at cancers, about 10% lower cancer. Look at mortality from heart disease, it's about 20% lower. And then overall, all-cause mortality is about 10% lower. There actually was no detectable effect for vegetarians. But the problem with vegetarians is that many people who are vegetarian are also really athletic, and they are thin, and they don't smoke. They are just into a whole healthy lifestyle. And what I'm showing you here is not just a simple correlation. It's the added effect of the diet once you control for everything else in that person's life. And so the trouble with vegetarians, they do so many things well, we couldn't detect an effect there, even though they had the longest lifespans of any of the people in the studies. Okay, so these things, the overall story of these is that healthier diets from all the studies that have been done, these long-term cohort studies, is that clearly good diets have the right number of calories. That's sort of point one. They're high in vegetables and fruits. They're high in nuts and whole grains. For the meat that is eaten, it is fish and seafood that is the major meat that is healthy. And they should have about 30% of their calories from oils, especially olive oil. But the warning about this is a tablespoon of olive oil has a lot more calories. I don't remember the exact number. It doesn't take very much oil to have 30% of your calories from it, so don't go home and drink up olive oil. Okay, and they're very low in sugar, trans fat, starches, processed red meats, and so on. Things you probably know. But here's sort of another, here are the environmental implications of these dietary shifts. So here's what we project is going to happen for the production of food, just growing crops, how much more greenhouse gas would be emitted. This is that 80% increase I talked about in greenhouse gases caused by current diets and their trends. And here's what happened, and zero is where we are right now. So this is going up from where we are right now. That's 80% increase. Here's what happens with Mediterranean diet, a much smaller increase. Here's this pescatarian diet, less greenhouse gas than now. And here's a vegetarian diet, even less greenhouse gas than right now. So diet has a huge impact on the greenhouse gas impacts that otherwise would be coming from increased food demand. We can have healthier diets that really, truly, literally are much better for the environment. And these healthier diets also require a lot less land. I told you we'd have to clear around 700 million hectares of land. Well, here's what the data is. If we have a Mediterranean diet, we clear 450 million less hectares than that. This is how much land we can save. Pescatarian saves 500 million. Vegetarian saves 550 or so million. I can't read it. You can see where the number is better than I can. So not only are these diets healthier, think about how much money you save if you don't have to be treated for diabetes for the rest of your life, or for heart disease for your life, or you're spared cancer. Huge savings financially, a huge increase in quality of your life, and at the same time, you are helping lower global greenhouse gas emissions and sparing many species from extinction because of land clearing. Now here's even more data, and I love data. This now shows incidence of all-cause mortality, coronary heart disease, diabetes, and stroke for each individual group of foods here. The single best food you can eat for those four things on average are whole grains, followed by nuts, legumes, etc., going over to the worst things you can eat: processed red meats, sugar-sweetened beverages, foods with added sugar and red meat. These are the baddies over here that have a mean that's significantly above 1. 1 is living the average lifespan. These take years away. These give you years of life. And here are the environmental things associated with that, or you can put them all into one graph like this. So here is the environmental impact. 0 is the average impact of all foods on average that we eat right now. Things lower, whole grains, nuts, legumes, fruits, veggies, fish are healthier, less than 1, a lower incidence of disease. And here are the things that are bad for you. Red meat, processed red meats, increase your risk of death, of diabetes and heart disease. Sugar-sweetened beverages and sugar added to foods. And ones that are about neutral, chicken, dairy, and eggs are sort of didn't differ from 0. So if you actually look at this, if we really adopted healthy diets, we basically get rid of all the problems I told you we're going to have. We end up growing less crop because we have less meat. We don't have fertilizer going up. We barely need to clear food. It's not quite 100%, but it's almost a full solution. If we really shifted over to really healthy diets, all for everyone in the world, we could solve the vast majority of the problems I just described to you. But we're unlikely to do that. But knowing that that's a strong lever, that's something we really should think about, given all of its benefits, not just for the environment, but for human health. But there are other things we can do on the environmental side that also can save farmers money, and that is we can use inputs much more efficiently than we have in the past. And there's something called precision agriculture. It's applying the right amount of fertilizer, the right amount of water, at the right time for the demand of the plants that you're growing. And when you do that, you can get away with about 30% less input and still have the same yield. So here are some countries where this has happened. Here's Germany. It happened because the European Union in 1994 or so passed something called the Nitrate Directive, a law that said basically our waters are too polluted with nitrogen, and you're going to have to get a permit to buy fertilizer, and on your permit you're going to have to explain what your yields were. You're going to have test your soil, and that will then tell you how much fertilizer you can buy and apply to your land. And here's what was happening until this happened. Here's what happened when it happened. They applied less than, but look what happened. Yields are up. Here's yield. If you actually graph this against year, you would see that yields are following the same increasing time trend they always were on, except that now Germany is having those much higher yields adding about 30% less nitrogen. The same thing happened in Italy, it happened in France, and the same thing happened at around the same time in Mexico, but for a little bit different reason. Mexico was the birthplace of the Green Revolution. Norman Borlaug basically producing more food by a big increase in fertilizer and seeds of plants adapted to live and give high yields with high inputs. Well, the Mexican government, to have that happen, since they had very poor farmers, provided basically free seed and free fertilizer, and then highly subsidized seed and fertilizer, until around the mid-1990s, at which point they cut off the subsidies. At which time, farmers found out they could use less and still get somewhat higher yields. So farmers, when they had to pay the price, as you might imagine, by this time had the money to do it and were able to increase yields while decreasing inputs. Doing this means you're using a lot less fertilizer, and the fertilizer that was applied in excess and did not go into the plants went into the environment. It was the source of the ammonia in the atmosphere, the source of the nitrous oxide, the source of the nitrate that polluted waters. So that reduces the greenhouse gas emissions from the nitrous oxide and so on. In these cases, yields didn't decrease. If you underapply fertilizer and yields decrease, then to feed people, you have to clear more land. So there's a balance you have to worry about here. But when you have 7.5 headed toward 9 billion people, all that you do are balancing trade-offs that are there. Okay, so let me see. Next quick solution here, using diversity of crops and intercropping as a way to have higher yields. We talked about how high plant diversity led to greater productivity with these prairie plants. It's been known for a long time that if you grow the right crops in alternative rows, let's say a legume and a grass like wheat or corn, that you'll have a higher amount of food produced per acre of land doing that than if you grew just one or the other. Growing those two together is called intercropping. It gives you about 15% more yield off a piece of land than if you don't do that. 15% more yield isn't bad. That's 50% less land that we have to clear and so on, and it's done needing less fertilizer. And growing alternative crops can actually reduce disease incidence because it's harder for a diseased plant to have the pathogen spread from it to another plant of that same species because they're further apart when you grow them in alternative rows. That's actually used now to control a disease on rice by growing 2 different varieties of rice in alternative rows in China. So some big benefits from this. Not huge, but it's a 15% solution. A postdoc who's working with me, Delphine Renard, did some really interesting analyses on crop diversity. I quickly told you that more diverse ecosystems are more stable. They vary less in response to climate variation. Well, she wondered what would happen in nations that had a greater diversity of crop. It's a bit like having a more diversified portfolio. I hope all of you are fortunate enough to have some money that can be invested in something. And if so, I hope you don't have it in one stock. And here's what happens here. This is the stability of this yield. Each dot is a nation. And it's how stable its production is. It's the average production divided by its variation year to year. It's a measure of how stable it is. And here's how many crop species they grow in each of these nations. Nations that grow more crops, that have a more diversified crop portfolio, have greater stability in their yields. And surprisingly, and we don't know why this happens, in nations that have very low rainfall, some of the driest nations, those nations that have more crop species also have slightly higher but significantly higher yields. We don't know why having more crop species leads to higher yield. It's just right now it's just an interesting, unexplained effect. Okay. So crop diversity is another 15 or so percent solution. And the final thing I want to mention is something called yield gaps. So if you're a good agronomist and you go to a place and you know modern agronomic techniques and you grow a crop there, you'll be able to have a certain yield on it. And you can ask, how does the yield that a good farmer or a good agronomist get compared to what real farmers get? Well, in countries that are rich and developed and have a well-educated and well-financed agricultural system, the yields are basically the same. The farmers are getting the full potential off that land. But in many nations, especially poorer nations, the yields are much lower. They are a half, a third, a fourth, or even a fifth of what they could have. And that difference is called the yield gap. Well, here's where the yield gap is. So this graph shows yields for crops in terms of how many calories are produced in each nation per hectare of land per year. And you can sort of see here the richer nations, the darker colors. China has high yields. And look here, sub-Saharan Africa, some of the lowest yields in the world. And here's their crop demand, a high crop demand. With that high crop demand and those low yields, they're going to clear a massive amount of land to feed their people in the next 40 or so years. But there's been a lot of work done, agronomists doing research in all these different countries, and most of these countries have yields that could increase by a factor of 2, 3, or 4 with modern techniques. And I'll sort of show you a graph of this. This is a very simple measure of soil fertility, how much nitrogen fertilizer is used. There are many ways to have more fertile soil. I'm not proposing they should all be fertilizer. But here is sub-Saharan Africa. Each dot is a year from 2003 to 2013. Here are their yields. Here's their input of nitrogen. Look at Southeast Asia. Here are their yields. Here's their nitrogen. Look at China. Yields of nitrogen. There's a really clear relationship between how they enhance soil fertility and how much food they get. And if these nations were able to increase their yields up about 3/4 of the way up this curve, they could close this yield gap, and instead of clearing that amount of land, they're clearing this amount of land. And that's going to save about 3/4 of the land that would have otherwise been cleared, which should be enough land, if it's done wisely, to massively decrease the extinction risk that the large mammals in Africa otherwise would be facing as the African nations become more populous and richer. So, I have talked quickly. Look at this. So I've given you 5 solutions, and I want to sort of now just sort of think about where we are. We have a world that's heading toward 9.5 or so billion people. Even if you look at the last century, from 1900 to 1999, global population went up 270%. Global per capita income went up 360%. So the two of those, how many people there are multiplied by, I sound like my friend Paul, multiplied by how much they buy is a measure, Paul Ehrlich, is a measure of the environmental impact humans had. There was a huge increase in human impact in the last 100 years. Our population is only going to go up 30 or so percent in the next 50 years, but we're going to have global incomes go up another 300% again. People are becoming, the modern Asia, the Asia of 50 years ago that exploded in its economy and its population, is now what's happening in the economy and the populations of the African nations. They are exploding, and we have the capability, we have the technology existing right now to have that increase in population, increase in food demand be done in a way which actually provides everyone in the world with healthy diets without needing very much more land than we have right now, if we close yield gaps, which we don't have to do totally, and if we can change diets towards healthier diets. We had a 15% solution, a 20, a 15, 100, and 100. We only need 100 in total. If we can do enough of each of these, we can have a world with 9 billion people all having healthy diets, and a world that still, if you will, has the ecosystems of the earth and its organisms preserved potentially in perpetuity, with the global population leveling off at that point. So I'm optimistic that if we do things, we can solve these problems. The question is, the really big unanswered question is, how do we do these things? What do we have to do? What kinds of institutions do we have to set up? What kind of policies will it take? How can we incentivize changing diets, changing farmer practices? How can we get seed and fertilizer to farmers who are too poor to buy it for themselves? How do they get crops to market? There are lots and lots and lots of issues. These were solved when the Green Revolution swept through many Asian countries 40 or so years ago, and when it swept through Mexico and South America. We need to have it solved now as the same thing happens in developing Asia. And I may not have the best solutions. I don't know. I've told you the ones that I've thought of that I think can work. There may be other solutions that are much better than this, and maybe there are other solutions that would be more likely to be adopted. I like to say that if I had the money, I would right now establish a Nobel Prize for the best tasting, healthy, environmentally friendly food. And I'd find some way to give it out, to spread it among about 100 people in each nation of the world every year, year after year, and make a catalog of the absolute best tasting food out there that is good for you and good for the environment. Because we have to somehow change what people do. We're not going to do it by me telling you what to eat, but if you bump into some food you really love, you'll start eating it. And if it also happens to be good for the world and good for your health, then we've won the battle, and we've won it with you wanting to do it. To me, that is the kind of solution we have to have for that part of incentivizing. To me, that's all I can think that could work. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, because we do have this problem. I showed you the data, pretty tight data, on what people like to eat when they have more money. They're really telling you what they prefer. And what they'd like to eat are foods that are not very good for them and not very good for the world. We really like things that were limiting resources back in our deep evolutionary history, which are no longer limiting. And so we are adapted to the past, as all organisms are, but we're really changing very quickly. So anyway, I guess in summary, one more slide, I hope here. I think if we look at sort of this planet we're living on, there really is a way to make this be a livable planet, a place for 9 or 10 billion people to live, but we have to live different lives. We have to control our consumption. We have to do it wisely. We have to realize that there are lots of trade-offs it's going to take for all of us to live on this planet, but we can do it. We can preserve biodiversity, and we can moderate climate change, and all the other things we need to do. These are all technologically possible, but we have to have the will to do it. Thank you for being here tonight.